And and I need screen share when you get a chance.
Uh,
And I'll let you guys know. So my friend Kyle and I did this presentation together. We have a class called Validity and Validation that we took with Dr. Shalou DeVille. And our chapter to talk about was this one. And we specifically focused on the credentialing half of it. So I'm really pleased to hear that there's someone who does the employment testing part here with us. And can you see my screen okay?
yes.
Okay. All right. So we approached this chapter kind of a little bit differently. So first, we'll just kind of touch a little bit on what is credentialing. I know you guys are probably more familiar. And then what we did was to look at tracking the changes across various editions to this chapter. And then a little bit of context of what were the authors in the field saying at the time. We may not go as much into that just for time purposes here.
Sorry, we are seeing in the screen like a Zoom. I think you're not sharing slides.
Wouldn't be a Zoom presentation without a technical difficulty, right? There we go. Okay.
Yes, now we can see the slide.
Yeah. Perfect. All right. So as you know, credentialing is referring really to any qualification and achievement that's used to indicate that someone is suitable for a purpose. A lot of times we use it to refer to occupations that have that as a gatekeeping mechanism for entry into the field. There is a nonprofit called Credential Engine that has actually been started in 2019 in order to make a database of every credential in the United States for both secondary and post-secondary credentials. And in doing this, they found over 900,000 things that were listed as a credential. So it's really showing that there's a lack of oversight in how that term is used. But within the type of fields where we refer to credentialing, they found over 12,000. So medicine, real estate, piloting, anything that has it as a gatekeeping mechanism. And from that, they kind of have this call to action to create a credential registry. And the part that's going to be relevant to us is that they want quality assurance agencies such as accrediting or standardizing bodies to contribute to that, to help with transparency, to publish data about the standards, and to really try to make there be more oversight on credentialing. So there is going to be even more attention to how we standardize credentials in the present compared to where we were the last time that the standards were put out. So what we really wanted to know is how has this evolved over the various editions? This chapter was included in the standards for the first time in 1985. So we've had 3 editions that include a chapter related to workplace testing and credentialing. And we set out to compare how it's evolved. So what we did is just created a spreadsheet and put things side by side. So for example, we compared background section to background section to background section. We compared each standard across so that we could really see how it's gone. The trends we found from there is in 1985, it was an extremely brief chapter. It had only a background section and 5 standards. And really it was talking about content and criterion validity. In 1999, there's a big jump. It is a much beefier chapter. It has 17 standards. And this is where they break the chapter out into workplace testing and credentialing. And this version makes very specific mention of employment testing to detect employee behavioral problems. They specifically mention psychopathology as one of the purposes. And there's a lot more detailed information given regarding the use of credentialing testing and issues related to like adjusting the cut score and cheating. 2014, there wasn't a big change from 1999. There was a little bit of additional information added, predominantly related to fairness. And you see that in the background section and the credentialing testing section intros. So mainly the changes you see here are for clarity to clean up the language. It is interesting that they took out any language that can be perceived as negative or non-inclusive. So you don't see mentions to psychopathology, for example. Instead, you see that the testing is as a tool for personal growth or to provide insight. So that's a very interesting change there as well. And so then we just looked at those introduction sections themselves to compare those. So again, in 1985, it's all inclusive. There are no subsections. It's just that one little brief snippet, and they mainly provide examples of jobs that require a credential, and they stress the importance of credentialing to protect the public. That's a theme that we see carried across throughout. And they really focused on content validity and stressed that criterion related validity may be problematic because a lot of times people who get the credential don't go on to get the job, and so it makes it more difficult. In 1999, a lot of these concepts were split out. So the introduction is more general, and then they do the more specific things within the narratives for the two subsections. And again, they really stress the purpose of credentialing testing here. 2014, essentially unchanged from 1999, other than, again, explicit language regarding fairness. So the big thing that they want to hammer on here is that fairness really means that the score needs to be the same for everyone taking the test, and that a score's meaning can't change from year to year. And let's see. And then we looked at the narrative that was specific to credentialing. We did not look at the narrative for workplace testing because that was not our focus. But for the credentialing narrative, again, 1985 didn't have one. All they had was the introduction. 1999, they really jumped on the reliability of the cut score and how that's assessed. However, there was a standard in 1985 that was related to reporting failing scores, and that's just completely removed as a standard, and instead they move it to the narrative. So they talk about it in 1999, but it's no longer a standard. So they really just relay that the tests are not designed to say to what extent someone passed or failed because of the precision that you need at the cut score. And then again, they start really getting in on the fact that it's important for that cut score not to change meaning from one year to the next. So they really start here pushing the idea that you shouldn't change the cut score in order to pass a specific percentage. And 2014 really keeps these same ideas. Here they add in that because there are multiple pass-fail decision models, you have to be explicit about which one you're using. They do address subscore reporting in the narrative, and they stick with 1999 that it does not return as a standard, but they elaborate a little bit more than they had in 1999. So here they really emphasize that the subscores are often based on a small number of items, and so that makes it less reliable than the total score, and that's why you can't really report on it. So it seems like this is just a conversation that's been ongoing. And the biggest change we really see in the narrative here is, again, related to accommodations. And one of the things they have here that maybe they don't have in other chapters is that the accommodations that are made for the test have to reflect accommodations that could theoretically be made for the job. And so you wouldn't make accommodations to allow testing for something that would never be feasible in that workplace, which I think is maybe unique to this situation. So just to kind of reiterate, looking at the actual standards, mostly the differences occur between 85 and 99. Again, because 85 only had 5 standards, it jumps up to 17 standards in 1999. And 1999 is where it's actually separated out. So there's a section of standards that are general to both workplace and credentialing, and then it separates out workplace standards, credentialing standards. The 8 standards that are relevant to credentialing only are where we really focused our analysis. And for 2014, most of the changes from 99 really involved increasing language in the comments to provide more concrete examples of how those standards may be applied. There are a few that we looked at specifically. So standard 11.2 in 1985 is really focused on construct interpretations. That is completely removed and is instead replaced by standards that focus on content validity evidence. And this comes up when we do talk about literature a little bit, is the push between construct and content. And then also standard 11.4 from 1985. This is the one that kind of gets into subscale reporting, because originally in 1985, it stated that those who fail a test should be given information about their score and how they performed on parts of the test used in the pass-fail decision process. So 1999, that is removed as a standard. It's talked about in the narrative, but it does not at any point return as a standard. there is one standard, 11.5 in 1985, that is virtually unchanged in all three editions. That standard notes that if you combine scores from one assessment or multiple assessments to make a pass-fail decision, the test taker has to have knowledge of that prior to taking the test. The only difference in 99 and 2014 is that they also point out that the relative weights on the assessment needs to be given to the test taker. I'll be a little bit brief on this part, but we did also look at relevant literature from these different time periods that were specifically addressing these editions of the standards and what were they saying needed to change. The big takeaways here is that in the early 80s, leading up to that 1985 or shortly after the 1985 version, there was a lot of focus on criterion-related validity. Specifically, there were 2 articles talking about lawsuits related to having to give criterion-related evidence. I think specifically there were people who were challenging, that were suing, saying that they had been declined a credential, even though they did have the skills to perform the job. And so they were really saying there's an importance to have criterion-related validity to show that this credential relates to the job. That's interesting because criterion-related validity has not reappeared as a standard in any edition because it's problematic. So they addressed that it's problematic. And then in the 90s, leading up to the early 90s, leading up to the 1999 standards, we see a focus really talking about the reliability of credentialing exams. So up to that point, reliability had really been reported more in terms of measurement instruments that assessed internal reliability. And here's where we see it shifting about really assessing the reliability of the pass-fail decision. Leading up to the 2014 standards, or right around the 2014 standards, one of the articles we looked at actually did look at the employment testing section and said similar things to what we had, that there was not really a big change between 99 and 2014. And then the one that we found the most interesting was actually by Ziniski, who was one of our guest speakers earlier, and really just demonstrating that there's a growing pressure for more information to be given to test takers. And really putting pressure on this idea that they need to have that subscale reporting or subscore reporting, that there's a pressure to give people taking the test more information about where they failed and how they failed, which I think is very interesting because there's a lot of pushback on that. So just to kind of sum all of this up, you know, that subscore reporting is really the biggest thing that jumped out to us as being somewhat contentious. It was originally in the 1985 version. It went away, it never came back, but now we're seeing renewed interest in that. So I think it creates a very interesting push-pull of what is the function of the standards? What are we trying to accomplish? And what responsibility do we have to the test takers? So I think that might be one of the more interesting conversations that came out of this. But really the thing that we thought was the big fundamental takeaway here is that, you know, credentialing examinations are there to protect the public, and we are seeing more and more credentials come about. And so there's a lot of pressure to make sure that we are protecting the public. And that was the big takeaway for us. We thought it was interesting that in 1986, there was the quote that there was increased public demand for continuing competence and accountability. And that's still true. Like, that hasn't changed. You could say this at any point along the spectrum. So it appears that ever since credentials first became an issue, they have continued to be a bigger and bigger and more important issue. So that is what I have. And I'll flip it back to you guys.
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you very much for this presentation. Yeah, it's a great summary and it's very informative. I didn't realize like the complexity that can arise, or the depth that we can acquire by analyzing all these changes through time. It's very interesting.
I agree. We set out to do it. I mean, honestly, we needed a project for class, but by comparing the way it's changed over time, I think it actually helped us to see what the issues are, more so than just reading one of them by itself. And I think it's very interesting to see what things stay year after year after year, and then what things just went away. and I do think, you know, the subskill or subscore reporting is kind of a big one. You know, there's a lot of pressure from the people taking the test to know where they went wrong so that they can improve it for next time. But that raises the question of whether or not that's really the job of a credentialing exam. You know?
Yeah, I agree with the psychometric aspect of it, and that the reliability of the subscore is not to be like read individually, because that's a lot of you know, there's a lot of complexity in the psychometric analysis that you do for it. So how do you explain to the test user that you know, this is what it was meant for, and then you may not be interpreting it the right way. But at the same time, how do you bring to the test user, you know, the value that they need to improve, or like the information that they need to improve going further? So I'm trying to think.
Yeah.
Well, and to how much longer would you have to make these exams to do that? Like, they'd have to be so much longer. And some of these exams are already quite long. So
Yeah, I don't think like changing the exam or its format is the issue here. It's just like finding an effective way to tell the test taker that that, you know, this is what it is. There's really no easy way to do it.
yeah.
But I don't know. I mean, I can see that if you are limited by the number of items that you made in the test, and you originally were not planning to have certain reliability in subscores, but actually you see the need for more information. For me, I mean, we should be able then to retrieve more information from the same items. So of course, if you rely on like correct and incorrect responses, you're not going to get that much extra information. But if you start to ask, for example, about response process, and you start to, for example, ask people to give a little more about how they responded, I can imagine that eventually can be like a way in which you don't add that many items, extra items, but still you get more information that then can help you to achieve the reliability that you need to make it useful for the test takers. I don't know, but I can see that to do that is a bit it can be complicated. I'm not sure if it's possible even, but theoretically at least, I think we are losing a lot of information because we are not asking about how people respond. So eventually, if you can, you can dig more in that part of the interaction between the examinee and the test.
That's a good point, because I think at least with respect to the credentialing aspect of it, it seems to be like they focus more on content related evidence, right? And so ideally, the standards say you have to try to acquire validity evidence to different types, and response processes are one of them. So based on the research on the response processes, definitely, I think that is a possible direction. Yeah, like just getting more information from the test is one thing. And then the other thing is still, you know, despite like getting all of that, you do have to demarcate a clear boundary in terms of the information you give to the test taker, like, you know, in terms of how it has to be interpreted. I think that's a key challenge as well, maybe more so practically than like technically or like research wise, in terms of what we do as researchers. But yeah, I do see that, because I also think that there's a lot of research on response processes now than there was like a few years ago. So maybe that could be used.
Yeah, the more technology too, because now that the tests are being taken in a computer, you have much more options to record this extra layer of information. Yeah, and sometimes even change the format of an item or the test itself. They can facilitate certain things that we couldn't do before.
The other a couple of things that I enjoyed in the presentation and I wanted to talk about a little bit more. One was the reliability of the subscores or cut score versus the pass-fail decision. Is that something that you mentioned? Like, emphasize more on the pass-fail decision. And so like I do a little bit of psychometrics, not a little bit, my research is based in this area. So I was just trying to think along those lines in terms of, you do have item response theory models, and I think those are kind of ideal to use in the credentialing area because they are the ones who those are the models that allow you to target measurement of the trait score at a particular area, because that's what you need, right? To differentiate like people who pass from people who fail. So you want the precision to be more at that particular area. So then how do you actually talk about the decision to pass or fails in terms in terms of underlying measurement? That's what I was trying to think.
I mean, I think to me that gets to the heart of, is reporting how well they did on the subsections actually the focus of this test? Like, for me, the credentialing test is to protect the public. That is the primary purpose of this. This is to make sure that the people who pass this are qualified to do the job that they're going to go do. And that protects the public from harm. And that's the primary focus. So I guess for me, the question is, yes, it would be useful for people to know where they failed, because essentially if you passed, you don't care where you passed the most, you passed. So that we're talking about people who failed and them being able to go back and study more in the area they failed. And that is helpful to them. But does that serve to protect the public? Because I think that's the primary mission. And so I guess my kind of push-pull is, should we be trying to give them those sub-scores? Like, does that detract in some way from making sure that we're being reliable at that cut score and making sure the people who passed truly passed, and, heeding that call to protect the public? So I'm kind of torn, because, man, it would be helpful if you had 8 different domains to know which domain was the one you really need to work on. But
yeah, but like that's a good point, and I'm just thinking back to some literature I did look into before. It also depends on the design of the test. Of course, I'm not like an expert in the credentialing area, but like are you allowing for the scores on one subsection to be compensatory to another subsection, or is it just like you're just like you need to achieve a particular level of efficiency on every subsection to be considered like past thing? So I think I don't know if the standards touch upon this, but demarcating those kind of scoring rules and passing rules while you're developing the test with a clear credentialing purpose in mind is a good way to start. So I would think about this as something to be looked into during test development, and then later followed through in the scoring process, and like even it also depends on how you market the test, and you have to tell them that you have to achieve a certain level of proficiency in every subsection. So then when you get back to it, so then I think people try and prepare for the exam that way. It's also like, it's very complicated. Yeah.
And I think the standard that touches on that is the one that says basically there's a bunch of different models, so you just have to make sure your test takers know which model you're going by. And I think it depends on the profession. There are some where you have to have a certain level of knowledge in each domain to pass the whole test. And then I think there are some where it can be sort of accumulated. But I think in medicine in general, for example, like you have to have a certain level of knowledge per domain.
Yeah, then that goes back to your point of public, protecting the public, right? Because that's such a high stakes profession in general.
One thing that I am not that liking that much from this chapter, and I think it's a general limitation in the standards, but I think in this chapter it's even more obvious. Is this mission or lack of precision regarding who should be in the table taking decisions? Because yeah, we can say credentialing, for example, needs to protect the public, but if you don't have the public in the table, then who is really taking the decision? I mean, it's so easy that we can make an interpretation about what is necessary without really confirming that it's actually the public that needs it. I mean, it's so easy to deviate. So, and I think that that's something that in general is not encouraged or mentioned in the standard, that first defining who should be in the table taking decisions, or at least foreseeing those decisions. And
Oh,
in not in providing, or I don't know, I can imagine that eventually you will need a standard saying you should at least have the voices of this type of people. In my mind, you should always include like everybody that is affected by the use of the test. So for example, I don't know, nursing. Yeah, you can define a credentialing for nursing, but if you don't have patients in the table, then you can really miss the point in terms of construct definition, in terms of what is necessary, more in the details on the test, and etc. And unfortunately, those gaps, those ignorances, if you want, when you don't have the right people in the table, then are complicated. I mean, society
but
won't be quiet if a test is really like missing the point, like grossly missing the point. So yeah, that part I think is kind of, I don't know. I would love to see more about, I don't know, like including more people in the definitions, at least for this topic. Yeah.
that's a good point, but then you have to also think about to what extent you can involve the public, right? So people who take these tests and people who develop these tests and people who review these tests are specialists. They've studied for like years and years on the particular content area. And of course, the public are just going to see that, I didn't get adequate treatment, or like I didn't get like, what I was supposed to get, which is really, really important, I think, because they have a right. They pay the money, they do what they have to do to get, and they also place their trust in those specialists who actually, treat them. But at the same time, they're only gonna be looking at it from one lens, in that I am the end, the end user, or like a person who's affected because you didn't do your job right. So I think this is more critical for like when you're talking about like medical accidents. I don't know the base rate for those, but I assume it's fair enough to be like considered anyways. And but I also want to say that that's just one area. That's just contextual consideration. So in which context are you using the test, and are you like, getting information? But still a large part of it should be devoted to specialists just because of their expertise in the area. Yeah.
But I mean, yeah, I mean, everybody can bring their own expertise. Experts, like trained people that have studied and worked, will have a very specific knowledge about how to do what to do with a test. But every group that is somehow affected by the test will have also their specific knowledge and quote expertise. So when you see examinees, they will have a very different new knowledge about the test itself and about the limitations of the test. So
you're talking about like focus groups, right? I think you're talking about focus groups, like that kind of research to get information.
The exact method that you can use to either inform yourself or represent in a more not that much about the knowledge and information, but also the political part of it, like who takes the decision. Both, I don't think it's okay to prescribe anything, but definitely you need to be more aware of that aspect of testing, because if you don't do that, then you are just like putting under the rug, like like ignoring something that is important, and then later it's going to like appear in sometimes in very unhealthy ways, if you want, like with a lot of aggressivity and in ways that you can do better. You don't need to like expect society to like scream to you to distance
Yeah,
to certain
I
situation that
do
might be.
agree with that point, and I think like with the technological advances that we have, it may be more easier to collect those feedback and analyze that feedback than it was like a few years ago. So I do think that's a good point to like include us in terms of a contextual consideration, and at least ask the standards to address that point. Just because of increasing dissonance in the society, or like more polarized society than we had a few years ago. So it's cool. What else? What did you guys think about the, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, like, I don't know if you have some insights to share on the workplace testing portion. Like, definitely my focus has been on credentialing. So I don't have as much insight on that. I don't know if you had any parts that stood out to you.
I think, yeah, this is like a typical, workplace testing validation process and the workplace testing part of it. So I don't know how much you guys are familiar, so I'm just looking at the figure on page 172 of the standards. So you do have content-related evidence, construct-related evidence, and criterion-related evidence. Typically, these are the three that we carry out for workplace testing. So response processes and I think, the fifth one is consequences of testing, right? Yeah, I don't know how much of that is mentioned in this particular chapter, but the consequences of testing involve, effect on diverse groups, adverse impact, and how those selection decisions, if at all, they adversely impact the protected groups. So I think a little more on that could be included in this chapter, just because it doesn't touch upon it. And I'm sure even in 2014, there was a lot more information available on that. So there are some things that could be included here in terms of, at least referring them to what needs to be done. And I think they briefly touch upon it. I'm not sure. Trying to look through it.
I love that little diagram that is in the
yeah, that's from like Binning and Barrett 1989, one very influential article that appeared, because prior to then everybody were just looking at content, construct, and criterion related validity as three different things. But then some articles around that time, especially this particular one, they argued that you have to establish everything, all kinds of evidence, in order to make the test actually be interpreted the way it's supposed to, or it's like designed to be interpreted. So the predictor criterion measure, the link one, typically that's just a statistical relationship, criterion related evidence, and then you just do corrections and so on.
Something that when I was reading that section and looking at the diagram, I love the diagram because it makes so clear. It kind of it kind of puts in a very simple way or explains in a simple way what many people have been doing so far when it comes to validate. But also shows you that there are many ways on doing that. And one thing at least that I don't like that much, and maybe I am starting to realize that it is important as well, every time you do validity, is that you should not rely on one single path, if you want, in that diagram. So you have like from measure to criterion construct domain, you have at least 3 ways to do that. Yeah, of course, more in terms of budget, maybe you will be able to check one way to kind of do the connection. But ideally, if you could have that path done in several different ways, then you have the power of triangulate. So if you don't see consistency between different ways to validate the test, then that should be something that you should be careful with. In general science, gains so much when you are able to triangulate. And I think that's something that we should encourage. And unfortunately, in our world in testing, sometimes we are too, we do one at least explanation and we are kind of fine with that without realizing that that's very dangerous, because even if you do your work correctly, still there is a lot of room for having certain biases, to miss the point in certain things. I remember I remember when the pandemic started, and the expert related with the pandemic, they were saying we need to triangulate the data to see if the models we are using are kind of accurate to represent the problem in terms of like infection rates or I don't know, propagation. That made so much sense to me. And then I was like, why we don't do that in our field? We should.
Because it's difficult.
Them.
It's like
And
people have a hard time filling out a single measure, and then your validity triangulation involves administering multiple methods of multiple constructs to them, and that's why, yeah, it's unfortunate, but it's true. Yeah, you're right.
I mean, yeah, I can see that there should be a very good reason, more practical reason of why we don't triangulate more. But if possible, I think we should try to have that. Yeah, and in general to have like multi-vision, like not necessarily having like one single vision about things, but like being okay with the possibility that there is a diversity of visions in general about the test that can happen related with the construct, that can happen related with the argument that you are defending. There are many ways in which you can have different angles, and it's better to accept that diversity rather than hiding that and put like one single view that then at the end is not really legitimized, because it's kind of tricky to trust on somebody that says that this is the way and no discussion of it. That's not realistic.
Yeah, yeah, I'm not sure if this is like they may have mentioned it somewhere that, you know, one type of validity doesn't substitute for another type of validity, but I do feel just because of the state of things in the applied world, we do need to emphasize more that, you know, all kinds of evidence are important, not only for like fairness purposes, but also like, you know, litigation and things like that. I think so this is like AERA, right? So we have a SIOP principles. SIOP is Society for Industrial Organizational Psychology, and that is like developed in the same structure, but specifically for workplace testing. So that particular document details a lot more of these issues, and of course they can't include everything here, so they're just given, but we do have a separate one for workplace testing, and that they do address a lot more. Yeah. Yeah, you can just think of it as like an expanded version of these 10 pages about workplace testing here.
One thing that I had like a certain allergic reaction to in the text was at the end. Let me look for that. Yeah. In the case of credentialing tests, the criticality of job functions is informed by the public interest as well as the nature of the work itself.
Where's
So at the very end, when it's speaking about fairness in the last paragraph. So when it's speaking about accommodation, actually, and I'm basically saying that there are instances in which you should not allow or expect accommodations because the nature of the work itself requires you to have certain skills. That I find it kind of tricky because when you say the nature of the work itself, again, who says that? Who defines that? What are the interests of the person that are defining that? In my experience, the few times that I've worked or deal with people with any type of disability or I don't know, like limitation that could eventually make you think that eventually somebody is not prepared for the quote nature of the work. Yeah, for the nature of the work, you might be surprised. So I mean, it's tricky sometimes when to say this person cannot do something because of the nature of things. Nature is always a concept that is never innocent. We put there like so much prejudice and so much, I don't know, like obviously it is based on experience, but sometimes it's not really exploring what are the possibilities that haven't been explored.
I think
in that part, it's kind of tricky. For example, I remember yeah, maybe I'm repeating stories like my parents, but yeah, I have a friend that he is a professor in Chile in psychology, and he is making this class about like the projective test, like the Roche and all this with, and he had like a blind student, a student that couldn't see. And he didn't know what to do in that case. And imagine that you put in your whatever condition for a psychologist to know that type of testing. Are you really, really needing that for everybody to know? I mean, that particular person, the blind student, yeah, of course, she will be limited eventually to interpret a Roche response if she doesn't understand the stimuli that is being presented. Theoretically, eventually she could learn. And actually surprising how many things people with disabilities are able to do anyways. But yeah, assuming that there is a hard limitation, even with that in mind, still that person is going to contribute in the workplace in a different way. It's not.
I have a pushback to that.
So that part is kind of like, yeah, it's good to have a standard, and so when you have a standard and it does kind of validate and legitimate, etc., nice, but still it's never innocent, that definition of the nature of work, and you can put a lot of, I don't know, like arbitrary things when you speak about nature of things.
Here's my challenge for that, and I'm going to speak prior to coming back to school, I worked in veterinary medicine for 25 years, so I'm going to use that as the example. In order to be a credentialed registered veterinary technician, there are 8 domains that you have to have full knowledge of, and that includes administering medications, monitoring anesthesia, drawing blood, microscopy, like looking through a microscope. It includes performing radiographs. So there are certain things that you could not do if you couldn't see. You couldn't draw up a syringe of medication and you couldn't administer it to a patient. And are there things that a blind person could do as a veterinary technician? Yes, they could answer phones, they could answer questions, but they could not actually treat the patient. And in order for that credential registered veterinary technician to hold the same meaning for everybody, you have to be fully competent on all 8 domains. So that if I tell you I'm a registered veterinary technician, you know that I can run anesthesia, and you know that I can administer controlled substances, and you know that I can perform radiographs. And so that's where I think that comes in as far as like the nature of the job. Like veterinary technician is extremely well defined. There's a state board that will list out exactly what a veterinary technician should be able to do and what they cannot do. So it's extremely narrowly, tightly defined. And so I think, yeah, if you made accommodations for somebody to pass that test and get credentialed as registered veterinary technician, but they can't actually do the job, I think then in some ways you're misrepresenting to the public. And so I think that's where this part comes in. Like, yes, there are going to be ways that someone can function in every job, even with those disabilities, but then you're changing the meaning of the title. And that's where I think they're drawing this distinction, is that title has to mean the same thing for every person, or you've changed what it means to pass that test. So that's how I perceive that one.
I kind of am on the same line in that, you know, I don't think the nature of work itself in this particular paragraph is meant to be like subjective, because the way I learned about it was that, you know, this depends on basically a job analysis, right? Conducted by a competent, like a job analyst, IO professional, whoever that may be. And that information, they have to, like, you know, they do a critical incidence analysis, and there are a lot of techniques to get to establish what the essential job elements are. And that's what a test targets initially for selection or credentials or whatever the purpose may be. Because, you know, there are jobs in which you cannot possibly detail all the elements of the job. That's just impossible on an everyday basis. There are too many things to do. But if you get at the essential job elements and allow for that to be measured in every applicant population or subgroup or whatever it is, then that is enough. Like, you know, so it's not meant to be interpreted subjectively. I think it's just meant to be what do you say, detailed sufficiently enough, because like Stacy mentioned, there are some jobs that everybody cannot perform. Like, you know, let's say your job is like a construction worker, you have to climb the ladder, do so many things. But if you have a disability that doesn't allow you to do that, and that particular function is a part of your everyday job, they simply cannot select you for that job. There are certain jobs to which you're more appropriately suited, and I think that's what the criticality of job functions targets here. So yeah, that's how I would think about it.
But I mean, I don't know. If you have a job in which you really need to know like each part that is included in the standard, okay. But at least, I mean, I can see that in the general case is more about asking a lot, or like asking a minimum in many things, in which in which the professional needs to be prepared, but it's not necessarily doing that all the time. So I agree that you need to do like a job analysis, but the job analysis needs to be a little bit more precise in terms of when do you have teamwork, when you can rely on others in the team.
Like, you know, so if you look at the Occupational Information Network, that's a ONET. It's a database for all the occupations in the US. It's about 1,000 jobs and so on, right? So when a job analysts start off to analyze a particular job, they do discuss with like job incumbents, supervisors, and they also used information from the ONET database. So if you go and look at one job over there, there are multiple content domains in which they detail out every task, every, like, you know, task and technology involved, your critical job functions, job activities. There's a lot of information available. I think it's also mainly making sure that the people who are actually doing this kind of practice, like if they are trying to analyze a job, are aware of, you know, how to use that information. So what I'm trying to say is that the information that you're talking about, it is already available for many jobs and most job categories, if not all of them.
Yeah.
And I think the US is like forefront in leading that effort.
And the other thing is that sometimes you need to be open to the possibility that some situations haven't happened yet. So if any job analysis, you also need to consider any new possibility that hasn't happened yet, but still think about it is feasible for somebody to work here, even if nobody else have tried before. And of course, that is a very different and more complicated analysis to do. But I think that's the type of things that actually really open the door for inclusion, and it's like the effort that actually can change somebody's life. I don't know. I always feel scared when we think that somebody is limited to do something a priori. It's surprising for me that how human beings find a way, even when they are limited, to do things that are sometimes like impossible to think, and they
Your
do.
point
I
is
mean,
like well taken, particularly in jobs that emphasize creativity and innovation. You can even think about research as a big example. Like, if I just take research as an example, they also talk that science is cumulative, but it's also accumulative. So you're building upon knowledge from the past, but it's also accumulative because you're allowing for something sudden to come and change the world. And like, yeah, there's only so much anybody who doesn't know that it exists, yes, can account for. But when it does come, I think every effort needs to be made to encourage that kind of effort and like, allow it to take things forward. Yeah.
I will say too, and maybe the language could be more explicit to your point, but it does say that the accommodation it's specifically referring to when the accommodation is altering exactly the thing they're trying to test. So when a condition limits the individual's ability to perform a critical function of the job, such that it's fundamentally altering what it is you're trying to measure. So I don't think it's saying you can't have any accommodations. It's just when it's altering a critical function of the job. So I think maybe they could be more explicit and say like, yes, accommodations are okay, especially if it works within the parameters of this job, even if it requires innovation. But I do think it's important to say that if it is fundamentally changing the definition of having this title, then I think that's appropriate. And again, that goes back to public safety. So I agree. Like I want to be inclusive. I want to give people their opportunities, but having served in that role for 25 years, like I took an oath to protect the public. And so there's always going to be that in my head of like, if someone truly cannot do something that is absolutely essential to that title, and them having that title would change what that title means, then I think that is problematic. So maybe this, instead of being a paragraph, maybe this deserves a lengthier conversation. Maybe it actually even deserves some examples of like what accommodations can work, or like give us an example of what you mean by an accommodation that just purely can't work. Maybe the brevity of this is not serving it.
But the thing is that the ability to perform a critical function of a job, that's basically a behavior. So that's basically something that you can observe that somebody can or cannot do some critical function. That's very different from the construct. And that's where I kind of like, I think is a problem in general, that when you put too much rigidity on the construct, then you are also not being correct in terms of what it means to do this. So you are kind of like shifting you are not allowing someone to perform or to be allowed to show they can perform because you are too tied to the construct.
So the links between the construct and the behaviors are obtained through the validation evidence, and that's why it's important to establish the validity of the test before you use it for like high stakes purposes. So you're right in that the behaviors and constructs
the validation part will assume and start from a construct. So most of the time that you do that, and the problem is that, and actually that's recognized by also many practitioners, that sometimes the construct is not really possible to define. I was reading like recently a paper from Chappell about language testing. And even in language that you would imagine that is relatively well studied and with a lot of people thinking of that, the construct itself is under a lot of debate. And sometimes it can happen that the construct that you need to measure for certain people is different from the construct you need to measure for other people, to then have predict or I don't know about their capacities to perform and to have a more behavioral or observed information. So I mean, yeah, if we are worried about performance in the job, let's worry about that. But if you say the construct is important, or the content domain that you define is important, then
I think
why you're
yeah.
gonna allow other people to maybe show you different ways in which they can actually perform in the way you want? And sometimes the
So
tests are too narrow in terms of who is the ideal person, or who is the standard person, or who is the minimum, when you actually may have different ways in which you can do the same job performance.
yeah, I kind of get your point. And then, you know, if you're not like starting from the construct, you do need to have an effective alternative. Maybe depending on the research that exists today, there are some methods of measurement, or like it's like, you know, the credential right now, I'm assuming it's just like you have open-ended answers, or like multiple choice questions, and mostly based on the traditional paper measures. So you could also look at advanced techniques to see if some techniques lend themselves better to measuring certain complicated constructs. So I think there's a way for there's some there is definitely scope for improvement, but you would also need to make sure that that research is thorough and that you're using it the way, because, you know, you're trying to solve one problem and you don't want to go ahead and create 10 others. So I think that may be something that you know, you need to ensure before
But
you
let me give you an example also, to maybe put more in concrete the things I was saying. I remember once I started to read more about accent, and how accent can be used to racialize people, and to actually like discriminate people to achieve certain jobs, because you quote require certain accent for the job. So for example, let's say you are looking for someone to take a position in sales. That person needs to sell stuff in the US. So yeah, you can say, yeah, because it's the job position requires somebody to have like communication skill with certain level, and to be able to communicate effectively, then you need someone that can speak in the language. But then when you define the construct and say who is the person that can actually, that is the person that can fit to this job requirement, you then in that moment you can put a lot of arbitrary things. So when you define actually the standard, and that relates with this idea that when you in general try to put yourself in a neutral place, then you can, for example, assume that the ideal language is the language of the majority of people in the market. And then that could be, I don't know, white, or it could be, depending on the job, the area in the US in which you need certain type of way of speaking. But still, that's assuming a lot of things and denying the possibility to someone that actually do have an accent to find a way to work around the problem. So when you that's why when I say the nature of the work itself, we can put a lot of things when we define that nature. When you say, yeah, it's a sales job, then the nature of the work itself is to have like the American Northeast accent. I mean, yeah, maybe, but who
I
said that? Who
see.
defined that? If a
Yeah,
white guy also was the one defining that, then how can we trust on that? And how can we
I
really be sure that somebody else with an accent actually can?
in this particular scenario, and like you can like fact check me on that. So if you were to actually go and see, I think they would say it's the ability to communicate in that particular language versus, you know, the accent. I don't know. I feel like maybe we're getting into too much detail here, but I do see your point. And yeah, if I were to do that like as a job analyst and like, you know, try to communicate with supervisors and things like that, I would make sure that the essential job element for that particular job would be to speak the language effectively than focus on the accent. But I don't know. Yeah.
I see your point, and I see how someone could abuse this wording in order to arrive at that. I think the couple of differences are that this is pertaining specifically to occupations that require credentialing in order to work in them, which are going to have a different level. They are going to have things where protection of the public is essential. And so I agree with you. I think the wording here needs to be cleaned up, but I do think it's important to say that, I mean, I do think it's an important consideration that if you cannot do the job this credential is for, then making an accommodation to allow you to receive that certification isn't appropriate. Maybe we need to word that such that we protect people from being abused by that, not having this used as a weapon to gatekeep people out of the profession. Because you're right, I could see that it could be abused for that purpose. So I think there's a delicate balance I don't know how to achieve between protecting the public and making sure that we appropriately include people. But I think there are going to be certain credentialed professions that not everyone is going to be able to do that. And to protect what that title means that there probably will be some degree of gatekeeping.
But I think at the very end, it's everything about what's the evidence to say that one single person cannot do something. That's the main thing. What's the evidence that you really need to have that type of claim? That is a very strong claim, actually, to limit somebody, say, no, from the information we have, you cannot do this. I mean, it is either like impossible or risky, and that decision is the one that requires enough evidence, and evidence that is not targeting the average. It's evidence that also can be diverse enough to provide evidence for each single case. So yeah. All right. Nice conversation. Thank you, Stacy, for the presentation, and Lavanya too for all the comments today.
Yeah,
like
thanks. The session. Well, it's good to see you both.
Yes.
Yeah, you guys too. All right, bye.
All righty.